Uh, Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to give it the next, 2 more minutes before we can start. Just waiting for people to join in. So I'll start approximately at 14:05. But thank you so much for joining, and please be patient with us for the next 2 minutes as we wait for other participants to join. Okay, I think it's time to start. Once again, thank you, everybody, and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. As all of you may know, today's webinar is themed, Is it possible to decarbonize the South African steel industry? And perhaps by way of setting the scene, I would like to mention the following, that steel is all around the world except in Africa. Steel is used in buildings, as concrete reinforcing, as rods in bridges, infrastructure, tools, ships, trains, cars, bicycles, machines, electrical appliances, and furniture. In 2023, globally, 219 kg of steel was used in new production per person, while in sub-Saharan Africa, the per capita consumption was significantly lower, at around 30 kilograms, which is mere 14% of the global average. To change this narrative, two Chinese multinationals, Tishan Holding Group, operating in Zimbabwe, and Denson Steel, operating in Zimbabwe, and Palm River Energy, are investing over $5 billion in Zimbabwe's steel industry. At the conclusion, this was to catapult Zimbabwe to being the biggest producer of steel on the continent, surpassing South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco. The investment comes at the critical time for Africa in general, which needs to reduce the infrastructure deficit holding the continent back. The investment coincides with South Africa's steel industry struggling, with imports from China being noted as the main reason, with the accusation of steel dumping being raised. Moreover, most of the steel investment will produce fossil-based brown steel rather than more environmentally friendly green steel. The challenges bring issues about regional industrial integration and decarbonization into sharp focus, which this webinar aims to address. So today's webinar seeks to explore whether it's possible to decarbonize the Southern Africa steel industry. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Tamin Kosi. I work at the Center for Environmental Rights as the Activist Support and Training Coordinator. The Center for Environmental Rights is a human rights law clinic focusing on the climate and environmental justice. We work mainly to provide legal representation to communities, but also facilitate processes for communities affected by climate and environmental related socio-economic impacts. We do this to ensure that they participate meaningfully in private and public decision-making processes. As a result, concerning the steel industry, the Center for Environmental Rights works alongside community-based organizations, for instance, like the Val Environmental Justice Alliance, that is living next to ArcelorMittal, South Africa steel plant, which we're hoping one of the panelists, Mtutuzi Shabalala, will share a bit more of the experiences that they've had as we're working with them. We are honored today to welcome 5 of our speakers that are going to be our discussants today. The first speaker would be Kudahashe Manungo, and we're going to have Anand Patanjali. We have Gerard Nima, Leon Govinsamy, and as well as Mtutuzi Shabalala from the Val Environmental Justice Alliance. At this moment, I will call on the presenters to briefly introduce themselves, tell us who you are, the institution that you represent, and perhaps a little bit about your work. I'll start with Kudahashe.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Tammy, for the presentation. Thank you to everyone who's been able to join this webinar, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. First of all, my apologies as to my lack of video connection. I'm in the beautiful country of Madagascar, and I'm in a small town where the connection is not as strong. So hopefully you'll allow me at this moment to at least use audio. As shared by Tammy, my name is Kuda Manjonjo. I work for PowerShift Africa. And for the purposes of this conversation, I am very much Zimbabwean, living in what I call the little sibling to Mpumalanga region in a town called Wange, which is, if I'm not mistaken, one of the regions with the most production of coal in sub-Saharan Africa. And most of my work is on transition minerals and green industrialization, what that means in terms of producing and manufacturing renewable energy systems on the continent. Thanks so much, Tammy.
Thank you, Kudo. We'll invite then Anand Patanjali to introduce himself briefly.
Thanks, Tommy. My name is Anand. I'm a value chain campaigner at Steelwatch. Sorry, my throat is a bit off. I'm usually based in Johannesburg. I'm currently based in this month in India. I work for Steelwatch. Steelwatch is a global corporate campaigning organization that envisions a steel industry that underpins a zero emissions economy and enables environment, communities, and workers to thrive. We are a small 2-year-old organization trying to make big impact on the corporate campaigning space, made with main focus on ArcelorMittal and Nippon Steel globally. And also we are trying to scope different regions and look at other steel makers who are not 1.5 degree aligned and develop campaigns on them. I'll keep that short. I'll pass it back to you, Demi.
Thank you so much, Anand. Jerome, would you please introduce yourself?
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm a bit of an under the cold, and if you hear me sneezing, just bear with me. My name is Christian Geronema. People call me Jero. I'm from the DRC. I'm a China Africa expert, and I'm also a critical minerals expert. I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I'd call myself someone who follow closely critical minerals activities in Africa, especially in the context of geopolitics. And I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. I'm thanking Kuda for inviting me to bring some perspective into the conversation relating to decarbonizing the steel industry in Southern Africa. I'd be happy to hear your perspectives as well.
Thank you so much, Kuda. Thank you so much, Jera. Leanne Govinsamy, a colleague of mine, previously at Center for Environmental Rights. Always good to catch up. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you so much, Tommy, and good afternoon, colleagues. Well done, Tommy, with the array of names that you had to pronounce today. So that was quite tricky. Hi, everyone. My name is Leanne Govinsamy. I head up the Just Transition program at Southern Transitions. We're a Global South think tank that are focused on advancing equitable and fair transitions within the Global South. And as part of our programmatic areas of focus, which cut across the multilateral space, key value chains, specifically around critical minerals, iron and steel transitions, and renewable energy. and some quite interesting work as part of a do tank, which looks at implementation of JET pathways or just transition pathway and the development of those pathways. For purposes of this conversation, I've been, as Tommy has mentioned, at the CER working on engaging with ArcelorMittal around its decarbonization plans, and currently continuing with that engagement and looking at what are the opportunities that exist within the iron and steel transition, not just in South Africa, but more broadly in the region and within the global south. Back to you, Tommy.
All right, thanks so much, Leanne. Happy to finally introduce the last panelist, Tutuzi Shabalala from Veja. Du brings in a wealth of knowledge, particularly on how communities can engage with steel manufacturing companies. I think it's going to richly enhance the conversation. Du, could you please kindly introduce yourself? Tutuzi, can you hear me?
I'm also struggling with network from my side. I think I would need to switch off the video. I'm not sure. But my name is Mduduzi Lala. I'm based here in Val. I'm working for Val Environmental Justice Alliance, which is a community-based organization campaigning for environmental justice and climate change awareness. Veja, we also have been working in close as a dog watch on ArcelorMittal, South Africa. Together, we have been working with partners, Center for Environmental Rights, Groundwork. Veja is also a member of the Global First Steel Coalition, which is a global movement of civil society organizations, particularly working on ArcelorMittal and human rights issues. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, guys, for honoring this call. And we're looking forward to kind of learning as much as we possibly can from you guys. So perhaps to kick us off, Kuda, is it possible for us to decarbonize the Southern African steel industry? As the first speaker, would you lay perhaps the foundation for us? You'll have the next, say, 5-10 minutes to give your contribution. So over to you, Kuda.
Thank you, Tammy. And I guess I started with the difficult question. So I will not answer the yes or no, but I'll answer with an explanation in terms of how I understand this issue around decarbonization. I think I'll start off by questioning the idea of decarbonization itself and what that means, at least from a continental perspective, right? As we all know, Southern Africa and Africa more generally has had the worst effects in terms of the impacts of the climate change and the crisis that we're currently facing. And because of that, there's been a push to try essentially limit the emissions or the carbon emissions that go out into the Earth and the planetary boundaries that we have as much as possible. As we all know, heavy industries such as steel making, cement manufacturing, what are usually termed the hard to abate industries, are one of the biggest polluters in terms of production. So now the question is, we are combining this with this very big headache we have on the continent about not actually having a manufacturing and industrial base for us to develop. So we have a twin challenge, the issue of actually developing, but at the same time, not developing in a way that's been done by the rest of the world in terms of using carbon-based production to essentially produce all that we see in the rest of the globe and what is then defined as development. So a big question I think, Tammy, that I'm then always asked is that, is it our fault, first of all, and should we concern ourselves with decarbonization since it was not us as the continent primarily that has led to such high levels of emissions? And the first answer I put on that is that it is within our interest to do so, from the simple point of view of that, since we are the ones who are being affected the most by the climate crisis as we know it. It's not only a moral duty, but it's also an economic rationale to understand what pathways are available for decarbonization. That said, of more focusing on the development nexus, as Zimbabwean, as I expressed, there's always been this interchange between how development works in terms of our energy systems. Like South Africa, Zimbabwe is very much coal based in terms of production of energy, and you need this, or at least that's the warrant when we speak about industries like steel to actually get development happening. And we're seeing from your earlier presentation, Tammy, and hopefully my colleague will be able to share a fact sheet that we've been producing around the two big investors in Zimbabwe's steel industry, which are the two Chinese multi-national companies. The logic has been of Africa, Zimbabwe, Southern Africa is essentially things we need on the continent, such as housing, such as roads, etc., etc. But the modus operandi of doing this is through energy from coal. So now the question is, if not coal, what other methods can be potentially used? I'll of course leave this to other colleagues of mine, such as Anand, to speak to the technicalities around green steel. But the idea then will become, can we use the potential, is the potential green hydrogen an option we have to think about very critically on the continent and what that means? As we know, in Namibia, for example, the green hydrogen boom has been a very big priority of the Namibian government. So I try imagine from my point of view, to answer your question, Tammy, decarbonization, I don't think will be, for example, Zimbabwe doing it by themselves, but is finding that regional integration based on our different strengths and our histories of our different countries to see how we can best collaborate. So I imagine, for example, if possible, the idea of a lot of the primary green hydrogen production being in Namibia, which then is supplying a lot of the industries, not only in Namibia, but also in South Africa, as you have in ArcelorMittal, as well as in Zimbabwe, with these Chinese investments. And I think that's the balancing act that we have, and what I'm hoping from this space that we are currently discussing, that we start asking ourselves, how can we engage with the investors that are coming on board to try focus on this more decarbonized pathways? The technology is available, it is more expensive, and those are some of the deeper questions we need to ask ourselves, that at this current moment, things like green steel are seen as more expensive. But as I said earlier, the question we are coming from and the angle we are coming from is that we have to do this as a moral and economic imperative in terms of positioning our industries as we go forward into this more decarbonized economic world order. And I think that's where I'll stop for now, and happy to get more information on this. And thank you so much, Pumla, for sharing the PDF that has been shared. And I think I'll just speak on that, Tammy, for those who have a chance to look at that fact sheet. You see, we've compared the two main companies in China, Dinsen, which is part of the Tsingshan company, which produces about 25% of global stainless steel production. They're a very big investor in, for example, Indonesia. And then there's the Palm River Energy, who are producing and developing a steel plant right by the Zimbabwe South Africa border. And if these two plants, as planned over the next 10 years, get to their capacity, they will be bigger than ArcelorMittal. So if the questions that are being raised by ArcelorMittal as we speak in South Africa around decarbonization stresses, this is something we need to also have a conversation about with these further investments from some very good and important partners, which are the Chinese investors, and how we understand and relate to them. And I think I'll stop here for now. Tammy, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Kudo. You raised a couple of questions that we need to think about. And perhaps something that I forgot to mention was for our participants or attendees to we're going to let all the speakers speak, and we urge you to, keep your questions, memorize the questions or write them down, the questions that you might have for the speakers, because we want to let them all speak, and then we have more time to have more engagement. So with that, I will go to Anand. Anand, over to you.
Thanks, Tammy. I'm just looking to share my screen. It's very interesting. Okay, let me know if you see my screen. Not right now.
We are now. Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, just give me a second. Perfect. Thanks, Tammy, for setting the stage, and Kura kindly giving the continental context as well. But just to go, I think what I'm going to give more of a technology overview on what green steel means, and also give a global perspective on the trends that are currently going around. When we talk about green steel, I think what we need to look at is first, how do we decarbonize iron making? So iron making and steel making are usually combined, and we say it as green steel. But green steel is
Sorry,
actually,
Anand.
yeah,
Sorry, we can see you now.
sorry, come again?
We see your notes on top of your slideshow.
Okay, no worries. Is it better now?
There we go. Yes.
Apologies on that. Yeah, so what I'm going to give an overview is the problem of the current fossil fuel-based iron making. And then the role of transportable green iron, that is green HBI, the role of electric arc furnaces in decarbonizing iron and steel making, the whole sector as well. And what does green iron value chains look like? And what are the current trends that we are observing globally? Let's look at this from a context of how much CO2 emissions that the sector emits, direct emissions we're talking about, because mostly it's only scope 1 and scope 2 that are currently being reported, and scope 3 emissions are not usually reported by many of these steel companies. So in that context, the iron and steel sector contributes about 7% of the overall direct CO2 emissions. And this you can see in comparison with the other sectors. There's a whole globally as per the IEA report. Now, why do you think the steel sector emits so much? And the problem is that majority of this comes from iron making. So what you see here is a current kind of a layout of how an integrated steel power plant works. When I mean integrated, where the iron making and steel making happens at the same place, and you get a finished product. And the majority of the CO2 emissions comes from the iron making that happens inside a blast furnace. And this emits, so for 1 ton of steel produced, 1.4 ton of CO2 is emitted just from the blast furnace itself. The problem is not just there, but for the blast furnace to function, you need metallurgical coal, and the coal needs to be prepared in coke ovens. That emits 0.71 tons of CO2. And the coal needs to be mined as well. So the mining, the methane emissions, and the transport, all this adds up. And this is why steel is a very dirty sector, or what we call hard to abate. And globally, 70% of the steel this produced today comes from this blast furnace-based steel making. And only 30% comes from a EAF, DRI EAF-based production. Apologies. So in terms of technology that is currently existing, if not for blast furnace, what do we use? The technology that exists and proven is the DRI, that's the direct reduction of iron ore. It's a huge vertical shaft, and the two big major companies are Midrex and Tenova. And this is not a new technology. This exists since the 1970s. And predominantly, it runs on fossil gas. Again, that is a problem. But how do we change that? This can also run on green hydrogen. So with green hydrogen being fed into the DRI shaft furnace, you get a very close near zero clean iron. That's green iron. And then that goes into the steel making side, that is the electric arc furnace. And that electric arc furnace can be connected to a renewable energy grid. And then what comes out is almost a near zero steel. This is the technology that's currently existing, and there are multiple projects across the globe. But what are the challenges here? The challenges are access to green hydrogen. That means like you need to have enough renewable energy to produce the green hydrogen that's needed. And also, as this DRI technology has predominantly run on fossil gas, there's a lot of push for the different shades of hydrogen, that's gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and all that coming in, trying to kind of muddle the green hydrogen effect and impact. When it comes to the electric arc furnace, I think the global problem is more on the scrap availability, but for Africa, that's not a problem because we are still at a growth phase where our trajectory, we are growing at about 3.7% in terms of steel consumption or demand for the next 10 years. I think we'll be about 59 million tons per annum by 2032, if I'm not mistaken. So post 2040 is when we look at scrap for Africa, but currently it's more on the availability of grid. Um, this is some kind of a trend that we kind of laid out from last year in terms of what is getting worse, what's stagnating, and what's getting better. And if you look at the center column, I mean, what's remaining flat is the global steel demand has remained flat. And the global metallurgical coal consumption has remained flat. And also the number of blast furnaces has remained flat. What's happening here is that new blast furnace constructions are happening, but there are more and more blast furnaces being retired or put out of commission for relining and all these purposes. But what's look good, what's getting better is the biggest steel producer in the world is China. And China has gone past peak steel. China is like the steel production is going down since 2023. And they are shifting to a more EAF-based fleet. They have their 15% EAF targets, so they have slowed down their BF blast furnace-based production and switching over to EAFs. And there are more number of DRI projects coming up using green hydrogen, and these are the good things. But again, when I say keep talking about green iron and green iron, let's go into what that's about. As I said, the first today how steel is being produced is all integrated. The coal comes from somewhere, the iron ore comes from somewhere, and they're all fed into this line. And the blast furnace puts out what we call pig iron or liquid pig iron, and then that goes into a basic oxygen furnace where the oxygen is stripped out and steel comes out. What the future looks like, or what the future we envision, or it's happening currently. An example is the Namibia High Iron Project, where the iron is made in Namibia using renewable energy and green hydrogen. It's being shipped out to Germany, where it's going to be put in an EAF and you get green steel. So it's green iron and green steel that makes this process or the entire near zero steel reality. And there are many advantages to this. And to me, the major advantage is not only the CO2 costs, but creation of many value chains across two geographies and creating more jobs in these geographies. And this doesn't have to be at a global scale. It can be in a continental scale as well. The green iron can be produced in Namibia or somewhere else. We also have Simandou, the plant that's coming up in Simandou, I think the high iron ore plant that's coming, sorry, I'm forgetting the country name, that's going to come online next year. And one that's come online, that's going to be the highest high grade iron ore that's going to be shipped out globally from Africa. I mean, this is just a mapping of the different green iron hotspots. You can see Australia there and South Africa and Southern Africa region, the Brazil region, Canada, and Sweden. The steel companies have mapped out here is more ArcelorMittal and Nippon Steel's current trade routes of iron ore, where they get the iron ore from. And you see the correlation is these iron ore are also green hydrogen hotspots. What that means is that they have good access to renewable energy. There's good potential. There's good scope of development, the grid, utilizing the renewable energy potential, and using the using the electricity to produce green hydrogen, either domestically or send that green iron to other countries where they don't have that, like European countries or Asia, where it can be used to produce green steel. This is my last slide, just to look at what the trends that have happened in the last 5 to 6 months in 2025. The European green hydrogen bubble has kind of burst due to expensive energy costs and a lot of discussions around CBAM and ETS. And The shift to DRI has stalled in these regions, majorly like ArcelorMittal and other players. And the focus has shifted more towards EAFs. And this is a good, and even China is shifting to EAF. So what's the good point about this? Shifting to EAF means they need to show green iron, and green iron comes from the global south, from the different geographies. Apologies that I've mentioned. And Middle East is moving quite fast, and there's going to be a lot of competitive green iron and green steel coming out of Middle East. Saudi and UAE are focusing more on gray iron production. That's gray hydrogen-based iron production and steel production, where Oman is leading more on the domestic market and export market on green steel and green iron. Simandou is going to be a game changer for the continent and the globe as well because of its high iron ore, and it's operated by Rio Tinto. Yeah. Apologies. I think, yeah, I hope this gives you an overview of the technology that's available today, and as well as what to look out for in terms of emerging trends, and what kind of trade is actually possible within the continental scope between countries in Southern Africa to produce more green steel and be self-sufficient and build more bridges, build more cars and industries, and put us on a growth trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anand. I think that was a very useful, outlook in terms of what the global trends are, and perhaps what the current context is, and the emerging, context as currently is we're experiencing. Jérôme, you would come up next.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you for giving me the time to give a few comments on this topic, and I'm really happy that Aman came way before, because he is providing us with a good context in terms of technical knowledge and expertise on the topic. Me, I'm gonna just draw some lesson from an experience that we got while reading a paper that was released a few weeks back when they were trying to think of how Indonesia was trying to decarbonize its nickel park, where we do have a lot of Chinese company investing there. So the same approach is that to think of like, what lesson can we draw for the steelmaking industry in Africa? It's not only for the steelmaking industry in Africa, but it's overall for the whole critical minerals and transition value chain in Africa. So the few points I want to mention here is the fact that I've mentioned it a few weeks back. I even shared with Kuda my talking point it was to think about the anticipating carbon lock-in effect when we build those iron ore processing plant, those steel making plant. We think of Dyson project in Zimbabwe, when Tsingshan invested a lot of almost 1.6 billion in that project. So the question is, what was the forecast? What was the forecast in terms of phasing out carbon, phasing out fossil fuel energy into that project? Because we do know that they were facing a lot of issue in terms of energy supply, and they were counting on coal. And as Kuda said himself, Zimbabwe is really one of those countries relying a lot on coal. And the question becomes today, how do we, for a project like this, how do we put the measure in place to make sure that there is a phasing out of fossil fuel, because those industry requires a lot of intensive energy supply. When you have a country that's facing energy supply problem like Zimbabwe or like South Africa, you do rely on what you have, and in this case it's coal. But we know that there is the debate about whether or not Africa should be going green and forbidding itself to use its own energy mix to be able to develop, or we can go green. But that beside the point. The point is the fact that we have to think of the carbon lock-in effect into thinking what policy that we put in place, what the measure we took in place, in a way that when we're designing those projects, we are putting them in a context where we do know that in a 5 years time, in 10 or 15 years time, we are phasing out of the fossil fuel industry, and we are going toward the green. And what are the policies and what the measure we are putting in place? The second point I wanted to mention here is about planning for special realities. When we build those kind of projects, and when we have in mind the goal of phasing out and the goal of going green, tapping into the renewable energy sources, the question becomes, where do we install those facilities? Most of the time we tend to, and of course it makes sense, we tend to build them close to the mines where it's happening. And the question is, where those mines are, when those mines are where where the iron is mined, do we have close access to a space where we can actually now move from fossil fuel industry to green technology, where green energy supply to be able to fuel those those industry. Most of the time, it's not always the case. Now it becomes on balancing the need of installing those plants in places where we do know that in the next 5 to 10 years we'll be able to phase out of fossil fuel, or we have to take into account the economic reality that it makes more sense to build them close to the mine because it's cost effective. Those are the kind of issue we also have to think about when you design those kind of projects. We also have to think when designing those projects in terms of like inclusive governance, in a sense where there is a need to include different stakeholders into the debate, in a sense where planning those projects require a wide range of stakeholders who are going to be impacted by those projects. So having their inputs, expert of civil society, expert from from different space of industry, to be able to provide an insight for government, for companies to build, and having in mind that we are building those projects in a sense with the goal that we're gonna slowly going green, we're gonna slowly move decarbonizing our process. But as I say, most of the time it's not always the case, because economic factors and economic viability are much more important for decision makers than anything else. And especially it's happening in a context where in Africa we always have that debate, as Kuda mentioned, the fact that we don't feel the need that we can be pressured into going green whilst we still, the lowest carbon emission makers in the world. So we don't really need to sacrifice ourselves in regards to be able to do that. But when we keep in mind that you do have now process like external challenges like the CBAM that are being put in place in Europe, that you realize that the question for producers in Southern Africa is like, are we going to lose access to market like European markets or other markets because of our non-green iron ore? So what kind of policy that we put in place? What are the approach that we put in place to allow us to be able to keep access to those markets? In the case of the CBAM, it's going to take effect in 2026, if I remember correctly. So looking into the Southern Africa region, are we ready to be able to get by the 2026 in time to be able to have access to those markets by greening, quote unquote, greening our steel industry? That's one of the big debate that we have to think about. Opportunities, when you look into opportunities, I would say, I don't know if it's opportunities and challenge at the same time, because in the terms of opportunities and challenge, we're gonna think about as I'm referring to that too much here, but in terms of, could I say, in terms of like having a regional approach. In the case of Zimbabwe, or in the case of even South Africa, Southern Africa in general, people can now think of like pooling resources, where a country can pooling resources instead of using coal. Do we have source of energy, for example, coming from the DRC with the Inga 3 project, that can be a project where we have enough energy supply to be able to boost to supply energy to those steel making industry? Do we have agreements? How do we get to that? We know that there was debate about the Inga 3 project, how to be able to do that. The whole debate shows us now another element of challenges in terms of financing. Now the question is, financing is going green. It's important, it's good, but it also costs money. The question of financing, how do we finance our decarbonizations of our steel industry? Where do we find the money? Where do we find the actors? Where do we find the stakeholders willing to put money on the table to allow us to phase out of fossil fuel industry when it comes to steel making in Southern Africa? Those are the few elements that I think we need to take into account. We need to think of when we want, and if we want to really decarbonizing our steel making industry. But overall debates, I think, stem from the idea in the base from policymakers to the idea: do we want to decarbonize at our own expenses, at our own expenses being us not using the fossil fuel, the resource that we do have. In this case, for Zimbabwe or for South Africa, it's coal. So it's a mix of a ideological debates and also an economic debate that we have to, for which we have to find a balanced perspective, in a way that we do not shoot ourselves in the foot just because we feel the need that we need to decarbonize, and even though we are not really responsible, at the same time also impacted the most by the green emission, by the carbon emission in the world. So those are the few thoughts I wanted to put in mind. I will not mention the case of China as an opportunity, because we have Chinese companies there. When you do know how China has cut all the financing because it's stuck to the financing points, how China has stopped financing coal project outside China, I mean, even in China. So the question becomes, how do we, as I mentioned earlier, how do we find the financing of all those projects, of all those alternative energy supply, green alternative energy supply, for us to be able to decarbonize our steel making industry? Those are the few thoughts I wanted to put there, and I'm really happy to have the debate with the receiving questions and the debate with the other panelists.
All right, thank you so much, Jero. I think just to defer to the chat, our attendees can look at the chat there. Kudo and Anand have been so kind to put some of the resources there. Anand has put some explainers, and Kudo has put some fact sheets, just in case comrades would want to have further reading. Also, there is on the question and answer section, there is a contribution that was made by Sarina Fenter, talking about the South African Iron and Steel Institute, that they've done some study and some work on this. We'll perhaps take the message and transcribe it into the group so that comrades can go back a little later if they need any further reading. Now we're going to head into Lian. Lian is going to speak to us. Lian.
Thanks so much, Tommy. Yeah, I think colleagues have covered quite a number of issues so far. So I want to try and distill out some kind of really crucial pieces of information. When we're thinking about South Africa's iron and steel sector, and can we decarbonize? Should we decarbonize? And Kudo spoke about the climate imperative. It's important to note that there's a health imperative here as well, and an economic one. So, from an environmental and health perspective, I'm sure that Mdu would speak to the impacts on fence-line communities when it comes to iron and steel making, iron ore mining and then steel making, and what that means, right? And so I don't think there's a question around that. Colleagues have referenced the CBAM, so the attraction of carbon border taxes on carbon-based products, and what the implications would be for those products. And there are also local taxes. So there are a number of reasons for decarbonizing South Africa's steel sector. And the difficulty, as has been highlighted, relates to not just, kind of cheap Chinese imports and, this kind of concept of steel dumping, but it's also other factors within South Africa around the cost of electricity, freight issues. AMSA has announced the closure of its long steel facilities. They've received government bailouts, and those are applicable until September of this year. And so there's uncertainty about whether those plants remain open. I think what is really important is to perhaps focus on some of the opportunities, right? And what's really interesting is, Anand has mentioned the kind of steel making process. You've got to produce, you've got to mine iron ore. You can use coal as a feedstock in order to make steel, or you can use green hydrogen. And when you look at the opportunities in South Africa, you've got the Saldanha Bay plant. In 1998 had been highlighted as globally competitive in terms of green steel making. It's Africa's most sophisticated steel making facility. And right now it's in care and maintenance. It's been mothballed since 2020, and local communities have been trained to work in these plants and are unemployed, and also face food insecurity in that area. So you can see why there is additional imperative for us to move from coal-based steelmaking at Vanderbijlpark in the interior of South Africa, and restart the green steel plant in Saldanha Bay. And the question is, how do you go about this, right? And what makes it an opportunity for us to do so? Well, locally, we have solar and wind potential. We have a Midrex plant that can be easily retrofitted. We have a skilled workforce available. There's iron ore that's available. But I really would like to also focus on what Kuda has mentioned around regional integration. Namibia has a much smaller population than South Africa, and it has land available for renewable energy production in order to make green hydrogen that could power the production of green primary iron. And the key question that then arises is whether in South Africa or in Namibia, should we be making green hydrogen for export, or should we be making green primary iron for export? So how do you beneficiate iron ore locally so that it adds value locally? You create more jobs. There is more of an economic benefit to South Africa and to the region, as opposed to exporting green hydrogen. Also noting the environmental impacts, the land access issues that are associated with producing green hydrogen at very large scales. So the question that then is really important: do you make green hydrogen at a very large scale and for the broader economy, or do you make it for cement decarbonization or for steel decarbonization? And how do you ensure that there are more fair and equitable outcomes in order to do that, right? And so some of the key considerations, and I'm sorry I'm moving through the slides pretty quickly, I'm just aware of the time constraints here, is how do you ensure that this is done in a fair way? So if ArcelorMittal South Africa decarbonizes, if it makes green primary iron at Saldanha, what are the implications for Vanderbijlpark, which is its primary coal-based steelmaking facility? Can you have a company-wide plan that advances a more just steel transition? How do you ensure that there are off-taking agreements that drive this decarbonization so that you are able to make the economic case for this? How do you create more jobs? So beyond the iron and steel sector, how do you create the demand for both green primary iron and green steel? And this ties into a really important consideration around green public procurement in South Africa and in the region. So creating demand in the region can either come from auto companies that are based in South Africa and that will also be subject to the CBAM, or you could look at the immense demand for public infrastructure. So you think about transmission and distribution in South Africa, you think about large-scale infrastructure projects. Are we able to look at green public procurement as driving the demand for green primary iron as well as steel in South Africa and within the region? And quite importantly, there are immense geopolitical and trade implications here. Steel, both in Europe and in the US, is highly politicized. And when we talk about us being able to make our own steel, it's also about creating regional self-reliance. And we need to be able to create regional self-reliance, make our own steel, but do so in a way that addresses multiple and intertwined factors around ensuring fair outcomes for communities, ensuring that there is an economic imperative, ensuring that we get the trade aspects right so that there are fair trade pathways that drive this decarbonization, and finance pathways where we can specify the conditions that are necessary in order for us to decarbonize in South Africa. So as opposed to having global north conditions set on financing, are we able to put together plans that drive financing in a more fair manner? Tommy, there are so many things that we could cover here, but I think, ultimately we need to think about not just talking about this in the language of decarbonization, but in language that is rooted in a just energy and a just transition, and think about regional integration and what do corridors of cooperation mean between South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe. AMSA gets a lot of its coal from Zimbabwe, and there will be knock-on effects from that decarbonization at Vanderbilt Park. How do we integrate these considerations and arrive at more fair outcomes? I'll stop there, Tommy. Thanks. Tommy, you're on mute, I think.
Sheesh. Thank you so much, Lynn. I think we're only left with Mduduzi Shabalala, who lives very nearby to ArcelorMittal, and perhaps he can share some insights in terms of how they've been engaging with this question, and perhaps some insight into how he thinks we can decarbonize the steel industry. Over to you, Mdu.
Thanks again, Tommy. Yeah, and thank you again to the speakers who have spoken before. I think this has been very meaningful engagement. I wish this was more widespread, for the entire public to have a listen, especially to these most interesting talks, because also we are of the perspective that to answer the question, yes, as Value Environmental Justice Alliance, we are of the opinion that steel has to be decarbonized as much as it is happening all over the world. So why not? Why waiting? Why will the sub-Saharan who would choose not to do it? For instance, here in Val, speaking about the historical experiences that are sitting with communities who are hosting the biggest, it's important to also talk about the impact. I'm glad that Leanne raised this in her presentation about the health aspect and the economic impact of it. And honestly speaking, we wouldn't like to see another decade or century of environmental and health impact in the name of steel demand. Because honestly speaking, again, in Africa, we are of a high demand in terms of steel and development. As much as the world also is shifting to the green iron,
Did we lose you there? Dudu, can you hear me? It seems like we've lost you there for a little bit. Dudu, are you still there? Such a bummer. I think we've lost you to.
I'm actually having bad network.
Okay. You're back with us. Okay, you can continue.
Yes, my apologies. Yes, as I was saying, yes, we feel as Veja, we feel that there's a need to have a decarbonized steel making because we are seeing this from the historical impact that we've seen. There's a need for push to have decarbonized or clean making ways of making steel. As we are learning also that there is responsible steel making, of which we also feel that Africa needs to be open to such of modern development, because other nations are developing and evolving from old ways or traditional ways of doing things. As much as we are talking about fossil fuel transition into a low carbon economy. I mean, South Africa, for instance, is one of the progressive countries in terms of legislation. So there is high possibilities of decarbonizing steel. And the biggest question now is, the biggest question lies with the capital that is behind steel making, because it's all in the will, and it is seriously all in the will of investors and the capital behind steel making. And what is it that they want? Because information is there, technology is there. For instance, South Africa is one, or Sub-Saharan is one of the hotspot of green iron. And if you're not going to work towards that space, especially to have such a critical mineral to benefit the region, rather than leaving it for other nations who are developed and creating steel in more responsible ways. We are seriously getting left behind as a continent. This is one opinion, because some of the things that we want to raise is, if we want green steel, or if we want traditional ways of making steel, especially, we also need to talk about the full spectrum of what that is going to come with. For instance, in our historical case, where is the water going to come from? And do we continually want to see the expand of land and environmental impact if we want traditional ways of making steel? We are interested, for instance, we are interested to have more case studies that speaks to historical ways of making steel. Like in Newcastle, for instance, we don't have enough case studies. In Saldanha Bay, we don't have enough case studies. At the moment, we have Zimbabwe, which is having the biggest steel maker in the region, but little we have information about the environmental spectrum of it. Other politics that comes with steel making. So, in the opinion, it is quite dangerous to want something without talking about the full spectrum of it. For instance, if we want green iron, or if we want decarbonized steel, we also need to talk about the full spectrum of it. What is that going to come with? Yeah, I think I will leave my information.
All right. Thank you so much, Mtu. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. I think they raise a myriad of issues, starting with Kuda, who mentioned the geopolitical role that China is playing in the steelmaking industry, talking about the need for regional integration to be able to address the question of decarbonizing steel. Also looking at the costs that would be associated with that in terms of being able to buy the technology that's needed to actually ensure that we go green. To Anand giving us a global picture and the current trends, and also the steelmaking process, and perhaps where most of the issues are, and also just how dirty the steelmaking industry is. To Gerard, who's talked about, again, re-emphasizing the regional approach that we need to have in ensuring the decarbonization of steel, talking about alternative energy sources, questions around financing, and also Leanne re-emphasizing the connection, particularly in South Africa, between the electricity costs and producing steel, talking about local beneficiation, looking at the environmental impacts of steelmaking, and perhaps what it would mean for going green, and talking about the outcomes for communities with Asana Metal at the level at which it probably would close down given all the challenges that they have right now. And also talking about the question around fair financing, right? To say the global north, global south, the north and south, in terms of is there fair financing with regards to transitioning as well? Giving us almost a grounded community effect insofar as the health impacts of living closer to a still producing company like ArcelorMittal. Also talking about the economic effects, with ArcelorMittal closing down, what does that mean for communities? And perhaps have communities been benefiting from ArcelorMittal being available or being around the area there, vis-a-vis the demand for steel? And also just the historical impacts that steel producing has had, and perhaps making an argument to say we have to go green, given all of the historical effects that we've lived with. And the bigger question, again, to say in our quests to continue to want to develop steel, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of going green and the environmental impact that these would have? At this moment, I would be open for questions from our participants or from our attendees. There's two ways in which you can do that. One of the ways is you can either raise your hand, and then we can come to you and you can ask a direct question to either of the five panelists, or you can write your questions in the question and answer section. We'll be sure to pick it up. So yeah, where we are right now is the question and answer sessions. So if anybody has a question, please, by show of hands, so that we can be able to address some of those questions. Okay, so in the question and answer chat box, there is a question from an anonymous attendee. How do we? So the question is, how do we ensure that communities form a central part of the potential solution to avoid a repetition of the socio-economic impacts of fossil-based industries, particularly steel making in this instance? So the question is around how do we make sure that communities are central to part of the solutions, insofar as trying to avoid the repetition of the socio-economic impact of fossil-based industries. I would open this question to either of the five panelists to perhaps attempt to respond to.
I think I can try to go ahead. Because it's one of the points I've mentioned in my presentation. I do believe that, as I was saying in my presentation, there is a need of having an inclusive governance around those issues. When we plan for those projects, we have to include communities from the beginning. They have to be part of the discussion. They have to be part of the process. Most of the time, we only stop by the decision makers only stop by saying we're going to create employment, we're going to create new jobs for you, which in reality at the end, when we realize how the technology involved in those industries, most of the time the job promise are not always the job created. At the end, the communities are really handed with the short hand of the deal at the end. So the question is like, how do we integrate them from the beginning to be part of the design of the project, to be part of like the governance of the project, even though we can acknowledge that not all of them will have the technical abilities to be able to find jobs or to be hired or to be the expert on the topic. But at least we're going to have input from communities from the beginning, from the inception of the project, in a way that we do not find ourselves into how do we mitigate the consequences of bad policy that we've put at the beginning. So for me, it's going to be an inclusive governance from which civil society communities are part of the discussion before it even takes place, before it's even implemented.
Great point, Jella. But it would be interesting in South Africa. Sometimes inclusive process does not necessarily suggest that communities' voice is taken into cognizance, right? And that's another political question that we always have to ask. I mean, perhaps we need to use the word like democratize the space and negotiations insofar as what this means for communities.
Because it's
so,
it's also raised the question of like who representing those communities, because oftentimes realize that at some time we can rely, depending on the country, say we can rely on local leaders. And at some point, because local leaders are who they are, some people say they start to become more friendly to government, more friendly to companies, that they forget the local community's interests. Some would say we can rely on, I don't know, on civil society, but even civil society are not spared from any kind of external influence or money, financial influence that can, push them toward a certain angle when they talk about those issues. So it's really become a very question of, you say, democratizing the process, but also in terms of like rules and regulation, transparency, and the political culture of the country, political economy of the mining sector in that country, in a way that we find a way to really integrate those communities early on. And those voices are really the voice of the local communities, not the voices of some people that have been handpicked to kind of pretend they represent communities on the ground. Yeah.
Absolutely, Jero. Any other panelists want to attempt to talk to how communities should be involved from the beginning, so as to avert a repeat of the historical mistakes that we've made? Okay, in the absence of that, there's another question on the question and answer section. And the question is, what are your views on the newly released draft carbon budget and mitigation plans regulations in South Africa, and how they might affect the steel industry? So I guess, Leanne, contextually, this may necessarily relate to you. What are your views on the draft carbon budget and mitigation plans regulations that have been, promulgated in South Africa? And how do you think this might affect the steel industry?
Hi, Tommy. Hi. Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we have a lot of different laws and regulations that are driving industries to change in one particular way or the other, right? Whether you think about it from a carbon budget perspective or carbon taxes, and you're driving mitigation. And what has been clear from ArcelorMittal South Africa from the start is that, at least from their perspective, is that while they accept that there are certain actions that they need to be taking, ultimately, are they in a position to be able to implement? And does this then affect them negatively, right? This is the perception that they have around some of this. And so whether you look at the CBAM, for example, or you look at any type of laws or regulations that are driving mitigation, corporates will always say there is no economic case for them to move in a particular direction. And it will impact them negatively. And so us being able to engage quite keenly and with all the required stakeholders and required information on why this is not just about a climate imperative, right? Being able to engage a corporation at that level means being able to engage very carefully with also their own economic imperatives and saying, well, this makes sense also from an economic perspective, and these are all of the reasons. And so I think, Tommy, at the end of the day, it requires all of us in the different spaces in which we work at a community level, whether we're driving change through regulation or corporate accountability or legal accountability measures, to also engage with some of these economic factors that they're having to contend with. And it's an unfortunate position to be in, because corporates have realized massive profits over the last couple of years and decades, really. But it does require all of us to come to the table to be able to engage on this and what the opportunities are in relation to that. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, Leanne. I think there's a question that could also go towards maybe the whole panelists. Sadly, we've lost Kuda because he's in Madagascar and his network is not so great. So unfortunately, we don't have Kuda, but we still have the 4 other panelists who will try and answer all the questions. There is a question here that says, Kuda and Jero drew attention to the expensiveness of decarbonization, right? So the question is, expensive for who? And what are the externalities suffered by the polluted communities? So twofold. If we're saying decarbonization is expensive, expensive for who? And what are the externalities suffered by the polluted communities? Would you guys like to attempt to answer that, particularly Jero and maybe Anand as well?
I think I'm gonna try with the expensive for. I think expensive for it's much more expensive for both for all the actors involved. It's expensive for companies because adoption of new technology are gonna require new investment. It's gonna require new source of cash flow that they do believe that they did not need to begin with. Because when you use, for example, coal might be much more cheaper for you to generate electricity than using renewable, using green, using solar, using wind. And in terms of power production, it's not always the same power production level that's coal and that comparing to coal. So it's going to be costly for the companies in one hand. It also to be now question become how government react to that, because governments can also put on the table the fact that changing will also impact the output of the mining companies and how they're gonna impacting the revenue for tax revenue and all of that. So it's basically costly for the whole stakeholders that are involved in the project. That's why it's always better to think of those projects ahead. Reality is most of the time we did not think or consider those projects in a sense where we are going to say we're going to decarbonize from it. It was like we need coal, we need steel, we have the resources here, we have those energy sources here, we have coal. There's no need for us not to use it. So now the debate is starting. Many stakeholders are thinking like, okay, what's the long-term impact on how now for us we move from that space, and who's going to bear the cost? Because when government are asking things like that, or when civil society are asking things like that, the stakeholders on the table, the government and companies are looking each other. It's like, who's bearing the cost? Who's paying for that? Who's on at which cost? At what moment are we going to pay for that? And if the answer is not so clear, they're gonna always find a loophole to either, postpone the decarbonizing process of the project. So at the end, communities also are going to be impacted by that. But even when it comes to local communities, it might sound weird, but the reality is when you go to impacted communities, you don't find most of the time people connecting the impact of climate change on them and the reality of how decarbonizations are happening around them. Most of them then say we like those products because they generate money, but when you tell them it's also generating, increasing the CO2 emission, that's at the end come impact your life, the quality of life. The connection is not always made there in a sense where you cannot find always into communities great and good, let's say, good allies to be able to fight with you into decarbonizing again. Because in that debate, companies can say to local communities, if you are pushing us in that direction, we may not be able to create as much as job that you guys want to work in this community. So it becomes a very tricky debate to take in place. But yes, I believe that it's costly for all the stakeholders involved, but at a different level, a different stage.
Nice. Anand and Leanne, do you want to attempt it? Expensive for who? But also the question is the externalities suffered by the polluted communities, right? So not only are we looking at the expensiveness of it, but what of the communities that are actually suffering from the pollution that has been coming out from the steel mining?
Let me answer it quickly. I mean, like mainly you say it's expensive from an off-taker perspective when comparison to traditional steel making. But what nobody takes into account, the current market prices don't take into account the historic injustices of mining impacts and the community impacts globally that never has been reflected in any Scope 3 emissions or Scope 4 emissions, nothing. So how do you, when you have this regional industrial framework, um, the policymakers are still looking at it from a country-specific lens. Even that doesn't include the aspects of uh, past impacts into the current framework. So it's going to be a lot of effort to have like a cross-country regional industrialization framework to account everything, and who's going to pay the price of all this? It's going to again come back if the government is going to implement this, or going to be a part of this implementation along with other stakeholders, and the government is going to be an off-taker in terms of public procurement. Then who should be held accountable? Is the government, or it's the steelmakers, or it's a whole sector as a whole? That's a question as well.
All right, thanks, Anand. While we're still on the same subject, I mean, there's a question to say, you know, apart from decarbonization of steel, of the steel industry, shouldn't we put a hard stop on green hydrogen projects for exporting, considering the land and the water impacts that they have? Right. So it's in as much as we're talking about decarbonizing the steel industry, shouldn't we say hard stop on the hydrogen projects for exports, particularly when we consider the land and water impact that it has? This would be for the whole panelists, if anybody has a view on
I can jump in, Tammy, if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, Nakuda. Good, that we have you back.
Okay, fantastic. My apologies for that. And I think it's interesting on this point, and I'll then speak to the question that I just saw around regional integration in the question and answer. A hard stop for exports, I think, is part of the conversation. However, the geopolitical angle then becomes extremely important. So, for example, with Namibia, a lot of the investment in their green steel has come from Germany. In South Africa, the financing for green steel production is, at least on paper, still being provided by the Just Energy Transition programs, which again are coming from the global north. And more or less globally speaking, there's an argument from African countries that since we do not damage the global climate, we're supposed to get reparations, right? Climate reparations is supposed to finance some of our transition plans. So I think the conversation now becomes, when you're now speaking with these global companies, they ask you pertinent questions. How am I going to benefit if I'm going to give you this money? You know, they're not taking this a moral perspective. It's more or less a hard economic argument that they're providing. I do think, of course, they understand the moral persuasion of things, but the reality is the just transition right now, as we know, is going to be unequal. We'll have regions that are moving towards a transition quicker than others. And the challenge becomes, from a continental perspective, are we strong enough to hold our ground and say that we are best positioned to lead the globe to the green industrialization around green hydrogen, and we will not export until such a point where we are acknowledged in these frameworks. So funny enough, the reason why I'm in Madagascar as we speak is that I'm at the current SADC summit meeting, and industrialization is a very, very big and deep conversation that's currently being held. And as we unfortunately do on the continent, we have such strong industrialization plans that are more country focused, and we pay lip service to the issues around regional industrialization. And why that combination is important from a more regional perspective is that if the countries combine and have more of a force, rather than Namibia, Zimbabwe, South Africa going by themselves and trying to have a conversation with China, it is easier and actually more powerful to have that very difficult conversation with potential investors, quotation marks in this case. So I think that's a very important issue. We have to understand how these two issues are very much interrelated, and one does not happen without the other. Thank you.
Great stuff. Okay, thanks, Kura. I think there's one question from Ulrich here. He says he worries about decarbonizing the steel industry and end up decarbonizing the global north only instead of decarbonizing the entire planet, right? So what he argues is that merely pushing for decarbonization for the sake of the climate only would leave the host and or polluted communities behind, right? So the question is, how can we decarbonize the steel industry in a fair and just way while ensuring that the communities, as well as those affected by the past pollution, are taken care of and are involved throughout the transitionary stage of decarbonizing steel, right? He says he asks this because we may end up with a neo-colonial tendency with our renewable resources still being exported with little to no local benefit, right? So it's also the question of beneficiation, once again, to say, do we just decarbonize for the sake of decarbonizing? What does that mean? for communities or the hosting communities that have been polluted previously. And also the question is to say, how do we decarbonize the steel industry, and ensuring that the transitionary stage brings along communities? Is this not going to just be another neo-colonial tendency with renewable sources that are still being exported with very little coming back for local beneficiation? Anyone wants to attempt to respond to that?
Can I try? Can I try?
Sure.
Because I think I also have other responsive issues to related questions that came before. But what Ulrich is saying is exactly what I was trying to express earlier on, because decarbonization of steel, I think entirely it all depends on the might and will of the capital behind steel makers. And one of the biggest concerns now is Africa still poses a huge potential of a lot of solutions like critical minerals in terms of decarbonization of steel. But are we now saying, are we going to be open? Are we going to be more open for more global north, especially economies that are better established, to come and explore more while we are still stuck in old ways? And one of the concerns being especially around externalities, because the expenses, it is always and all the time that expenses are always determined by the capital behind steel makers in this case, because they have risk assessment, risk assessment professionals who advise them, and they're not going to put their money on risk. Communities are always going to pay with externalities, with their health. And it's unfortunate because all the time communities have to go through the experiences of paying with their health. Without capital, the capital is experiencing, the difficulties of business making, because all the time we are being told that it is expensive for producers or employers. But unfortunately, communities always have to go through the experiences of bearing the brunt. So in response is that as Africans, I think we need to be better informed before we start engaging, because it all starts with prior information that has to come to an area or a community that is going to host, these industrial developments. Because if people are less informed, they are always going to bear the brunt.
All right. Thank you so much, Mtu. Colleagues, I'm mindful of time. We may have to maybe leave it here. But just to say, there's a lot of questions. There are a lot of contradictions, of course. There's a lot of thought processes that we still need to go through. This is just but the beginning of the conversation. And perhaps the best thing to do is to always keep the conversation going. Hopefully, we can follow up on this and have a much broader, discussion on this. But yeah, it's just the beginning, and we will be following through with another series that we could perhaps delve more into the issues. At this moment, I would like to give all our panelists perhaps just a minute where you give your parting shots or anything else that you think you may have left out, in just under a minute, and then we can call it a day. Anyone can go of the panelists, but just a minute each, just to say parting shots, and we can.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. I can go very quickly and say, we have to consider decarbonizing steel within the context of, kind of iron ore beneficiation, and ensuring that we have a more holistic strategy. So this is not just about the steel industry. This is a bigger question around green industrialization. and diversifying economies and making the connections between regional economic development that is also advancing kind of climate and environmental imperatives as well. So, some of the comments that I made around green public procurement as a regional strategy that could be potentially supported through SADC, for example, is really crucial in driving local demand and local financiers as well, being critical to addressing some of the concerns about global north financing. Thanks.
Hi, Tommy, can I jump in? I'm worried my network might drop again just in case.
Yes, you can go ahead, Gula.
Yeah, fantastic. And thanks so much, Leanne, for that. And I think I just wanted to really push on Leanne's point around green procurement from our countries. And why I think this is important is because as we keep talking about the offtake agreements, is there a market for it? We are exporting rather than using it on our continent. A big part of that is because we need our governments to actually take the lead in telling the rest of the world that we are serious about decarbonization. And a big tool, as Leanne has mentioned, is procurement, right? So, for example, there are policies at an African level, a SADC level, around how they want to essentially finance the transition. Money is there from the African Development Bank to the World Bank, and governments have the opportunity and the positional power to actually argue that for every dollar that's coming for infrastructure development, it has maybe 10 cents should go to green steel products. This is something our governments can do. This will not solve all the problems we're mentioning, but what it does, it gives insight to potential investors, to potential industries, that the focus for these countries that do have the potential to move away from fossil fuel-based steel production is there. And also, and I think this is an important point for me, China as a potential partner, and I always hark back to a point that was shared with me by the Chinese ambassador to Africa, and they stated this: we know what we can get from Africa. Africa does not know what they can get from us. And what he was basically implying was that China is willing to provide, as mentioned by Anand earlier, electrical arc furnace production, to have decarbonized systems as the primary form of production with the investors that they're bringing in. Our government and ourselves are not demanding that as clearly as we should, and are just focusing, as we know now, in producing as we do. So there is potential to drive this agenda and really change the way and understandings of what we understand as industrialization. Thank you.
All right.
I'm
Thanks,
gonna
Kuda.
go. Yes,
Yeah, Jerome?
I'm gonna go on what Kuda said. So, based on, since you mentioned China, so yes, to really create that space for China to be able to do that, we have to be able to create market and economic opportunities for Chinese investment to find ways to do that in our region. And it allows me to also to address the question of how can regional industrialization framework can effectively support green and sustainability, in a sense where they can support them by creating opportunities, that by addressing the challenges, because all collective solution will come with some country will lose, some country will win to a certain extent. So countries needs to be able to discuss, to look each other in the eyes and say, you know what, you're gonna lose here, you're gonna win here, but collectively you're gonna win in that regional integration. But most of the time, the collective approach kind of create the tension between cooperation and rivalry, between cooperation and competition, that I think that countries in the Southern Africa haven't found a way to address yet. And I do believe that industrialization, in the regional industrialization framework, needs to be able to address those kind of issue of cooperation and competition in a way that each country is highly incentivized to be able to be part of the solution. If regional we can be able to do that, of course we're going to create now an opportunity and a market, external market, for countries like China to be able to come and say we are willing also to be part of that, because there is a collective approach, there is a huge economic market that we can take advantage of in that context, which I believe that we're still failing to do.
All right, great stuff, Cheryl. Anand and Mdu, your last parting shorts.
Yes, if I may go, I'll be short. Yeah, my take is that, especially to us advocacy workers, I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of influencing policy. We need a lot of work in terms of influencing policy, like the integrated steel policy. We need to talk more about scrap and protecting it, because the possibility of decarbonizing steel relies also on scrap. And as I've learned from Anand's presentation that not only from scrap, but other ion materials. So we need to have a policy that protects such. And with that, we engage a lot with ArcelorMittal executives, ArcelorMittal South Africa executives, also at global level. So it gives us a lot of courage and opportunity to engage in such space, to influence policy especially. I think this is where our biggest challenges lie.
All right. Thanks so much, Mtu. Anand, the last one. Anand? Anand, you still there? It seems like we've lost Anand. Perhaps maybe just lastly is to say, this is just the beginning of the conversation. Us working with communities, we primarily know that, you know, these conversations are much more complicated and much more complex. And perhaps the most important thing is to take our communities along with us and always keep in mind that there are communities who, whatever the trade-offs are, who are the bearers of everything else that comes as a repercussion for whatever the choices that we make. So it'll be very important to ensure that everything and anything that we do, we're consultative and we bring in communities' voice to find expression in how they can design solutions moving forward collectively with us. With that said, I would like to thank PowerShift Africa for opening up this space for us, and hopefully we can have some follow-throughs on this. It has been a pleasure to have such esteemed panelists. And yeah, thank you so much for engaging with us, and thank you so much for everybody who partook in this session, in this webinar. Hope to see you next time.